Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. So we continue on our reflection, inshallah, on harvesting new generations, the positive development of black youth. And this is the section, The Crisis of Black Adolescents, Socialization in a Hostile Environment. This reading is necessary because a lot of times we're hearing from people, they just focus on the issue of personal responsibility and they're blaming individuals. And personal responsibility is extremely important. But it's not just an issue of personal choice. You know, when you're socialized in a hostile environment, there's a consequence of that. And so one of the main ideas that is first put forward here is that black youth are living in a hostile environment. That hostile environment is a continuation of what was the case in the past. And what was the case in the past is that you had a dehumanizing slave system, and then before that you had the members of the black community that came into the Americas. They were taken from Africa itself. And so the environments that we see, especially in these inner cities, are an extension of that problem of a hostile environment. That's the first. We cannot just focus on the issue of personal responsibility without talking about the social environment, which is problematic, which has increasingly in today's time become more hostile to youth than what it was actually even in the past of recent. Here it says, if we are to, however, harvest a generation of black youth who will have a greater chance to achieve their personal or their true potential, we must help them to overcome the pervasive racism and oppression that impairs their natural development that comes from outside of themselves. Right? This will not be an easy task, for the obstacles to this goal are seemingly overwhelming and are deeply rooted in the American way of life. But these obstacles must be uprooted and replaced with seeds that will sprout new vistas and that will provide black youth with positive alternatives to the social malaise they are now exposed to. And that becomes the question, you know, what types of alternatives are being generated that will allow these youth that are in these social conditions that we're seeing that are dehumanizing in today's time? What types of alternatives are there that will allow them to exit, you know, that type of lifestyle or those choices or that environment which is hostile to them? He also has a section on hip hop, on the juvenile system, and also factors contributing to gang membership and participation in violence by youth. And so the first thing that he introduces is this concept of youth being in hostile environments, right? And so that's the question that was just posed, is the question that we have to keep as a fundamental to our frame, is like, what are the positive environments or alternatives that are being generated? And I think that, for instance, if we deal, one of the things, if we come at this question from this way with regard to what are the alternatives that are being offered to, you know, youth of African descent, I think from here, from the same thinking, if we center these youth that are in these environments, and not all black youth are in the same environment, because some come from well-to-do families, some come from the suburbs, so they have a different set of issues. Here we're talking about those who are in hostile environments. If we're able to deal with some of these questions, we will be able also to deal with what's going on with other youth, because African American youth are not the only ones that are in these type of environments. If we look at, for instance, in New York City, if we look at what's going on with the Yemeni youth, or Detroit, Michigan, or Dearborn, Michigan, we look at what's going on with those, or the Latino youth, or if we look in some places in Chicago, we look at what's going on with the Desi youth. And even if you were to go across the waters and look at England, what's going on, you'll be able to see that there's some serious issues when it comes to Muslim youth across the board. But, you know, what has happened for a long time is that we decenter talking about the black community. And because we decenter talking about the black community, we lose a lot of understanding. And part of the understanding that we lose is how this society can impact a certain group of people very negatively. Because part of the Muslim community is not experiencing the social disorientation that those who live in urban environments are experiencing. And the situation of black youth in that environment is much different than the situation of Yemeni youth or others, Arab youth. It doesn't necessarily have to just be Yemenis. You have a similar situation with its own conditions with the Palestinian youth that are growing up in the suburbs, but their parents have established businesses in the inner city, and they basically majority of the time are spending their time in the inner city, and they develop their own culture in that environment. They develop their own culture in that environment, in that storefront or that gasoline or, that restaurant or whatever type of orientation within the hood. It creates a certain type of mentality, and you're not going to find this conversation in any books because this stuff is not studied. It's not even talked about amongst Muslims in a mainstream way. These are things that, we have to realize, that are unique to the community, but most of the times are not being dealt with. Right. So he says in the early 40s, the American Youth Commission partially addressed this problem by sponsoring a series of studies to see whether Negro youth face, this goes way back, right, distinctive problems in their development as individual personalities. The term Negro youth was being used at that time. It's not a term that's used in today's time. I used the word partially to describe these studies because they did not fully examine the effects of racism and oppression on the personality development of black youth. Right. Instead, they conformed to the research models developed by Robert Parks, dean of the Chicago School of Sociology, which had gained broad acceptance as the foremost methodologies for studying social problems. And this happens. This happens a lot of times when it comes to psychology, when it comes to sociology. And this is why, some of our ulama had brought this issue to our attention, that just because you study at the university and you're studying a particular science doesn't mean that that science is ready to deal with your situation. So psychology is not ready to deal with a lot of the situations that the Muslim face. It's a beginning. When people begin to study psychology, is a beginning. But psychology, as you're studying, is mostly dealing with the European American phenomena, white culture, so to speak. And so in order to be able to deal with the tools of psychology, you have to learn how to work with it as a body of knowledge and then apply it to the different contexts and different settings. Psychology, if you apply it to the African American community as you're studying it, or to the Latino community, or to the Arab community, or to the Indo-Pak community, or to the Bosnian community, you have to understand psychologists themselves have said this is extremely problematic. Because the situations psychologically of the Bosnian are not the same situations of the, white American. And then even within the concept of the white American, the situation of the Italians is not the situation of the Irish. So you have to be very scholarly in order to be able to deal with a lot of these issues. It's not something that is unreachable. You know what I'm saying? But you have to have the tools. And so here, he's openly saying that sociology has its problems, right? Economically, the school, Chicago, when it came to economics, the Chicago school, it had a certain philosophy. We know that Chicago intellectually, when we start talking about the University of Chicago, is a very, very neoliberal conservative place compared to like a New York, or even the difference between, Chicago and the University of Pittsburgh, or for instance, University of Texas, Austin, or Berkeley. We have to understand that these schools are hubs for certain type of ideological or philosophical commitments. And unfortunately, Muslims haven't gotten to that level because our discussion is very minimal. These are discussions that pertain to the Islamization of knowledge and taking ownership of knowledge. We're not mujtahidun in these fields. We're not the ones that are leading in these fields. We're not leading the thinking in these fields. So we're basically following others in these fields. That's why they're never going to be able to, address our conditions and our issues 100%. As a result, these studies were preoccupied with social stratification, class distinction, and victim analysis, instead of the psychological damage that stemmed from racism and social oppression. Nevertheless, These studies were important because they involved many of our leading black social scientists of that period. And so here you have an intellectual, a black intellectual. They're using the systems that they're studying, but still they don't even know how to apply those systems to their own communities. And that happens to the Muslims as well. You can have, I've seen that many times. A Muslim psychiatrist, I go to him, sit him down, try to engage in a dialogue on how we should deal with the case, and he's absent intellectually. He's just going by the prescription. You're a psychiatrist, dude. You went to school for how many years? I expect you to give me a vibrant intellectual answer of how we're going to deal with our people. As a matter of fact, that's your community, it's your tribe, from your particular background. So you don't have a solution on how you apply a psychiatric treatment to that condition. The only thing that you have is a regimen of, well, this type of drug works. That's not what we're trying to deal with. You know what I'm saying? So that's part of the problem, is that we haven't reached that level of commitment to the process of growth and liberation. And so you can be from the same community, you can be trained and not know what you're doing. That's part of the dilemma that he's bringing out here, right? And so he's saying, okay, so there were, and I'm gonna say something to you. Back in the 80s and the 90s, whether you were European American or African American, what was coming out of the American universities was dynamic. You were talking about the post-60s era. What was coming out in the 80s and the 90s, we still have not benefited from it. And so this is from the 80s and the 90s period, right? You had a lot of thinking that was on another level about society, about community, about economics, about politics, and so on and so forth. So everything that is new, the Western academic setting has this problem where the latest research, they believe in the concept of abrogation or naskh in the most traditional sense. So they believe everything that comes now abrogates everything that comes before. And that's not always the case. Sometimes you can have a study that was done in the past that has more relevancy and vibrancy to now than the current studies that are here. But the general rule in academia is that whatever comes now, it cancels out what came before. So you're only allowed a certain span of time that you can deal with when it comes to research articles or whatever. 5 years is even too much. They want you within that 3-year realm. And so we can't fall into that because that's not a set rule. That's not a set rule. We can find stuff that, and even when we read our tradition, that's important. Sometimes that's part of the problem with the Salafi da'wah. The Salafi da'wah thinks that, that the only thing that is of relevant, not all of the Salafi da'wah, but there's a major trend. The only thing that's relevant, it was the time period of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba, and a few scholars here and there. So they cancel out everything that comes after in the name of going to the past to try to revive. And some of the traditional brothers, they have that problem as well. From the angle that, what's relevant is the tradition, and then they deal with the tradition of a particular time period and they say we're traditionalists. You have, 1400 years of reflection on Quran and Sunnah or revelation. So how are you saying that only this particular time period is relevant? Or only this particular school of thought is relevant? If we're going to talk about really the reality of scholarship, we have to understand the whole. And so the problem is set. I don't want to keep going into that issue, but he says, in researching the personality development of black youths, the researcher used case histories to document their findings, but they were careful to indicate that their studies should not be interpreted as being representative of all black youth. This happens in domestic violence studies. Domestic violence studies, what has been used in the court system, is unidirectional domestic violence, meaning that it's from the man only to the female. And the feminists have used that and they push that through the court system. And the court system has legislated that domestic violence education be used in certain circumstances. Well, usually those education programs are only dealing with the violence of the man on the woman. And we know for sure that every community is not on that model. There's certain segments of the European American community that are on the unidirectional model. But a lot of communities, and we've talked to people and so on and so forth, is bidirectional. Even in today's time, even amongst the European American community, you're going to find that it's bidirectional, meaning that women beat down men as well. that domestic violence is not just the man as the toxic man that's out to get the woman, so we have to remove the toxic man. You have, it goes both ways. But those studies, a lot of times what happens is that, we take it because we see the scientific label, we accept it. And so here this is real critical thought. He's saying in research the personality development of black youths, right? The researchers used case histories to document their findings, but they were careful to indicate that their study should not be interpreted as being representative of all black youth. And that's the same thing when it comes to domestic violence. Certain studies were used, and those studies were used in a certain way, and those studies became accepted, and other studies were rejected. The one who deals with that a lot is Dr. Tommy Curry, who had to leave the country. He's an African-American scholar. He wrote the book, Man Not, unique writing, unique insights, philosophy, and everything, research, because he did his whole thesis just using African-American scholars. But he had to leave the country. He's in Europe teaching because he had death threats. But he talks about how the domestic violence studies were used and how they were pushed, and some of them were not really academic. There was a political agenda behind it. And so we have to understand that knowledge, is involved with politics as well. Is the whole concept of objectivity is a lot of times not there. He says, even with this qualification, these studies did draw some general conclusions about black youth, which can be summarized as follows. One, that the double standards imposed by America's system of caste racism definitely had a debilitating effect on the personality development of black youth. Two, that black youth did not have equal access to the proper resources and institutions that were necessary to help them enter the mainstream of American society. Three, that class status within the black community played an important role in how successful black youth were in adjusting to the double standards of American life. The higher youth was on the social ladder, the easier it was for him or her to make this adjustment. Four, to compensate for their inequities, black youth often develop personalities that induce maladjusted behavior. And that's what we see, and especially in today's time within the hip hop culture. And then he talks about that too, how media creates a certain type of orientation. All of these things can be applied to the Muslim community. You know what I'm saying? Like the whole issue of identity development, and how is it that Muslim youth are developing, regardless of their cultural background, and the class issue as well. The suburban European Americans, I don't like using the term white, because white, a lot of times it really, in my opinion, it takes away from the diversity and the richness of European cultures in the plural, because you have Irish, you have British, you have German, you have Nordic culture, you have Polish culture, you have Slavic cultures that are in that line. And a lot of times those things get wiped out in the name of whiteness. So, even when you look at the class differences, those who grew up in rural societies versus those who grew up in the cities versus those who grew up in the suburbs, there's differences. And there's identity differences as well, and all of that comes into play. And so this can be applied to, the Muslim youth. How are their identities being formed, with the messaging that's being given to them? A lot of times we don't talk to the youth. How does it feel to be in a classroom with a hijab on, or your name is Muhammad, and you're going through the history lesson and they're talking about 9/11 and everybody's looking at you like, Usama, what's up? That becomes an issue. I've talked to my kids about that, and they talked about how it doesn't feel too good, because, when you're in a suburban environment, majority non-Muslim, and that comes up, the Muslim child falls into that, well, you were the one that participated in that type of activity, or your people did, regardless of what your ethnic background is. And so how does that lead to the development of the Muslim identity, and then the personal identity at that? And so that's why I said, this type of book, it offers a certain type of richness, because it's looking at things from another angle. It's looking at things from the angle of where the system is failing. and it gives us an insight to understand ourselves. So the first thing is that the environment, it has a debilitating effect on the personality development of Black youth. And that means that they always are looking, and again, not all Black youth, because here the second thing that comes up is class. How class, depending on your economic status, how that changes how you adapt and how you navigate. But of course, in the inner city, you know what I'm saying? Everybody in the inner city is saying, nigga, what? That's the reality. You see the Latino youth saying it. You see the European American youth saying it. You see the Arab youth saying it. You know what I'm saying? Even when you start going outside of that circle, and so it has there's a certain type of culture that has developed in that environment, you know what I'm saying, where it's internalized as well. And the music industry contributes to that, the drug flow contributes to that, the club culture contributes to that, but in specific, it has a debilitating effect on the development of Black youth, right? And the media comes into play, with that as well. And so at the end, he says, to compensate for the inequities, Black youth often develop personalities that induced maladjusted behavior, right? Around the same period, 2 other studies were published that attempted to explain the impact of an oppressed environment on the personality development of Black people. The first study by Myrtle's Hallmark Analysis of Black-White Relations, an American Dilemma, confirmed in greater detail many of the findings reported in the American Youth Commission's study. The second study, however, Karina Cardiner, oversees much Bollywood's mark of oppression, did little more than provide a victim analysis approach in identifying 26 stereotypic characteristics the authors alleged Blacks to have as a result of being oppressed. So, I want to say that, you see, this is a study these are a series of studies that were done in the past, beginning all the way back in the 40s, and then coming into the later day. The Black community is heavily studied. So when people start talking about violence in the inner city, it's not that we don't understand how that stuff develops. It's what happens is that the general public immediately assumes that it's the Black community that is a problem. And the environment, the environmental factors are not talked about. Even excuses are not given. And we always see that when it comes to shooters, the whole issue comes up. This one has a psychological problem. That one didn't. That one is inherently violence. Criminality is given a biological basis, and then melanin content, criminal by nature. And we know that there's no such thing as a genetic basis for criminality. There may be disposition, but you can't just say that, is in genetics that this person is a criminal by gene. That was a stereotype in the past. But here, the point of saying that is that a lot of us are talking, even people from the community are talking, and they say, well, these people have to kill the gun violence, but they don't talk about what's going on in the environment overall. So if we have that level of detail of study, why aren't we really understanding gun violence, in the way that we should in the public sphere? When you go deeper, you realize that there's a lot of issues that come into why there is gun violence. In the 1950, the Journal of Negro Education, published by Howard University, featured a special issue that further examined the personality development of Black youth under the title "The Negro Child and Youth in the American Social Order." This issue contained an impressive number of essays by such noted Black scholars as Benjamin E. Mays, Horace Mann Bond, Kenneth Clark, Robert Weaver, as well as E. Franklin Frazier. One article from this volume, written by Ira D. A. Reed, summarizes the general consensus expressed by the various writers. 1, the systematic subordination of Negroes to whites in the American social system has a discernible effect upon the socialization of the Negro. 2, the present racial organization of the American social system is a direct outgrowth of that subordination. So there's a system in place. And some of our brothers say that there's no systemic issues, right? But here, these findings are saying that 3, The resultant racial organization tends to provide for its members an escape from and compensation for the domination of the wider society, creating new values deemed essential to the Negro group's survival. And so here, this is where you start getting into there's certain behaviors, personality manifestations, or characteristics which are developed, like in the inner city. It becomes necessary to overemphasize your power and your strength. And so your conception of manhood has a lot to do with how good you can fight, because you have to be a warrior to defend yourself in a hostile environment. And then there's also the concept of developing the psychology of not trusting people because of the values that are in that environment. Of course, everybody's not on that same, program, but each group is developing how it is that they, survive in that environment. I remember one brother from Michigan, Muslim brother, he used to say that, some of us, before we get out of the car, we have the house key ready, because we live in environments where it's essential for us to have the house key ready so that we, are safe. Where you may not do that in the suburbs. You may even forget your keys in the car. You know what I'm saying? And so there's certain key behaviors that you develop in these environments. You're looking behind your back. You hear something, looking around on a constant level. You look like you're paranoid. So that's something that comes in to the psychology of people with these environments because of survival. Certain characteristics are deemed essential, right? Like not showing emotion, like in New York City, North Jersey, Philadelphia. Nobody, people a lot of times may not smile. That doesn't mean that they're not nice. People tend to be very nice when you talk to them. But there's a certain protocol, a certain code. You don't look too much. If you look too much, people may say, "What are you looking at?" And it becomes a fight. So everybody knows, or your tone of voice. Or you may have to include cursing in your language. You know what I'm saying? And so there's a certain set of behaviors that people adopt to survive. So thus, the socialization of the American Negro takes place in two general areas of social interaction. The one broadly cultural, the other narrowly racial. And neither of which is the process of socialization effected with other than marginal completeness and satisfaction. That's why when we look at, for instance, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the highest peak in that hierarchy being self-actualization, a lot of communities don't reach self-actualization. They stay struggling at the level of basic needs. Even psychological needs are not there. If you study the pyramid correctly, you can have an understanding of what are the issues in the society, because that pyramid is used everywhere. It's used in government, it's used in private sector, it's used everywhere. And so that's a standard for understanding this society. And it may not be the reality in total, but it is the reality, of white culture overall and the system, the system. And so in a more recent study of this problem, Leon W. Chastain identifies three conditions that shape character development in what he calls a hostile environment. Three conditions socially determined and institutionally supported characterize the Black experience: social injustice, social inconsistency, and personal weakness or importance. And that, is funny because if you go to Egypt, at least when I was in Egypt, there's things that I can do in the U.S. by jumping online or on a phone, finish with them in 5 minutes, that in Egypt will take a whole day. Because the environment infrastructure doesn't allow for that. And so you feel a certain degree of weakness before the system. And so you have to realize that, that there's an important, like everybody, everybody's not on the same playing field. Some people, I remember, if you grew up in the city in certain environments, some people didn't have running water. Some people didn't have heat in the wintertime. Some people didn't have electricity, or the electricity was about to be shut off. So the basic needs are not there. So how can that person totally focus on studying? Or you go to school, and when you go to school, you're worried about if you're in someone's neighborhood and what that means for your safety, for your life even. And so the level of fear that you're at, psychologically, where does it put you? You know what I'm saying? That becomes the question. And then that environment develops because there's no jobs. And it becomes a hostile environment, and Now why do we see all these block grants coming into the inner city? Because gentrification is taking place. Gentrification is taking place. But I guarantee you something that's not talked about much is that if you go into rural communities, you're going to see similar problems. You know what I'm saying? Go into some of these rural communities where there's no where there's no solid infrastructure and where there's no, basically jobs and so on and so forth. Then you're going to see drug abuse. You're going to see domestic violence. You're going to see psychological issues. You're going to see a lot. And so the society has been based on catering to certain groups of people in certain ways. And it just so happens that unfortunately, you have such a large number of the African American community impoverished. Not all of the African American community. And that impoverishment is not solely an issue of lack of personal motivation. It has to do with the fact that the community, overall has certain challenges. And those challenges have a lot to do with racism and structural issues. Capitalism can't afford to, employ all of us. That's not a promise of the society, guaranteed jobs for all of us. It's not a guarantee in this society. And so some will have jobs, some won't. The myth is that everyone can make it economically and is easy. And this, no, that doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. It's not like the society is guaranteeing you from the beginning a foundational start where you can keep growing. And that's where the issue of the wealth gap comes in and so on and so forth that people don't like talking about. These conditions then contribute to two forms of behavior, which, as Chestong notes, resulted in the development of two parallel and opposing thought structures, each based on values, norms, and beliefs supported by attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that imply feelings of deprecation on the one hand and a push for transcendence on another. Thus, the depreciated character seeks mainly to survive in a hostile environment, while the transcendent character advocates a universal affinity with the inalienable rights of man. Like, yeah, we can all do it. We all have an opportunity. We should all reach it. But then what you're experiencing psychologically and what you're experiencing socially is not that. You feel the constraints. You know what I'm saying? The transcendent differentiates itself from the depreciated by this central trait. The depreciated will sell its soul to survive. The transcendent will give its life to be. His thesis provides a basis for understanding the psychological dynamics that must be taken into account when developing a model for the positive development of Black youth. We can assume from Chestang's thesis that the degree to which a person adopts a depreciated character or transcendent character is contingent upon his personal coping skills, set of values, resiliency to adversity, and the level of self-esteem. I would say also to the social supports. Most of this is talking about personality development, so it's only a psychological read. It's talking about the individual. But success is not only due to the individual. Success is also due to social realities, certain supports that in place, access to certain services and realities and goods. But it's a good start, and I think it's better than where some of our Muslim brothers, unfortunately, some of them even from the African American community, they've been talking a lot of nonsense. They've been their positions towards the Black family is very hostile, and it's to be rejected. It's to be rejected because it's not a position that a Muslim that is given an empowering dawah should take. Because from the beginning, even in social services, social workers are trained to look at the strengths of people. You don't come in and knock down people. Even in the deen, the hadith of the man who killed 99 men. You have one figure in the hadith that's looking at the negatives of the person and another one that's looking at the potential of the person. Sure, Tawbah is open to you. The other one, no, Tawbah is not open to you. You? And just thinking about the concept. So the deen itself and the sunnah gives us that framework. But we have brothers that's not their mindset. And it's unfortunate. And it's not healthy. Because as community leaders, if we have that mindset towards the African American community, it's not only going to stay towards the African American community, then we're going to hyperinflate towards other communities as well. Oh, they're okay because they have wealth, this and that, and then you ignore the fact that there's family problems. you ignore the fact that there's psychological problems. Just because they made it in the wealth bracket doesn't mean that they're self-actualizing on other fronts. That's a mistake. You understand what I'm saying? We just because they're not in the ghetto doesn't mean that they're okay. And so that type of analysis, which you're glossing over social issues and psychological issues at the same time, you have to have both of them together. We have to, as Muslims, we have to look at the psychological problems and the social problems, the social environment and the psychological environment. Those two things have to be in the play. We look at the individual responsibility and the jama'ah. We look at the corrupt environment, you know what I'm saying, and the family. So if you study Sirah, you're going to see all of those dynamics. So those who, are talking about the black family, in recent times, there's been some posts like that. You know what I'm saying? Very negative towards the black family. And I don't know how we accept that. And before, it was very negative towards blacks as individuals. From the angle of blaming the black community for poverty. That type of, the gospel of prosperity logic, or the conservative logic that you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, is a bunch of nonsense. And so we have some solid studies here. And so, if we want to talk about creating change, there's studies that have been done by black leadership that see the problems, that have put their time into it, and it's systematic. And that's what's needed. We need to study from people that want to uplift their community, and learn them. And then us as community leaders, or, as concerned citizens, or, social justice warriors in a positive sense, we have to bring out these types of teachings. And so the issue here is, how do you create a psychology for dealing with the issue? And that's where the conservative brothers should be at. If they think that morality solely is the only, just have a good character, well, how are you addressing some of these other factors? Here goes a model. Here goes a model that's talking about the necessity to develop, positive psychology or personality. How do you do it? And this takes into some depth. It is doubtful that any black American is totally free from this scarring. This is the psychological. Thomas J. Edwards, he says that there's a, let me read this. Irrespective of these qualities of resilience and coping skills and knowing how to deal with adversity and self-esteem, that's all what the conservatives are seeing, that you should have that, right? Irrespective of these qualities, however, it is highly likely that every black person has developed what Thomas J. Edwards calls the psychological scar tissue. It is doubtful that any black American is totally free from this scarring, as we become scarred in different ways. So we have our own unique and private ways of reacting to the slings and arrows of outrageous racism. The medication used by black people to treat these scars is analogous to three forms of behavior: adaptive behavior, modified behavior, and compensated behavior. Adaptive behavior accepts status in life and tries to make the most of it, becomes indoctrinated to the blame the victim syndrome, develops a passive attitude towards racism. That's what we see from some of the conservative brothers. That's their behavior is adaptive in how they're dealing with this problem. Modified behavior modifies values to be more acceptable to whites, and they do that as well. Strives to achieve status within the norms and values of the black community and dominant white society in relation to the Du Bois double consciousness. Du Bois is this scholar that has been recommended by a lot of people in movement efforts. Compensated, and a lot of people don't know that Du Bois had a whole solidarity economy program. They look at one aspect of Du Bois, but Du Bois looked at also at the solidarity economy. Compensated behavior seeks to compensate for oppressed status by attempting to oppress members of his own race. And this is what goes on in the inner city, right? This is what happens in the inner city, right? And actually, this happens in the Muslim community overall. Compensated behavior seeks to compensate for oppressed status by attempting to oppress members of his own race. And we do that. Ana doctor. Call me doctor. I'm the engineer. I have the Lexus. I have the Tesla. I have this. I have that. And we compensate for feelings of inferiority in our community because people are coming out of poverty and oppression, this and that. by throwing that in each other's faces, what I accomplished in the dunya. Versus celebrating our survival and our transcendence out of those conditions and loving each other and upholding each other and building each other. We trample each other with that type of stuff. And so here, within the inner city, he says this behavior often becomes a victim of drugs, alcohol, and other forms of escapism. Not only in the inner city, also in the suburbs or whatever. We know Muslims that drink, Muslims that use drugs. There's other escapism. That's the compensated behavior. These patterns of behavior are not in themselves atypical of the manner in which most people adapt to the environment. But for people who are being victimized by oppression, these patterns of behavior do little to counteract its adverse influence. To merely be able to cope with oppression only sustains and perpetuates its existence. Muslims can take a good lesson from this. None of our spirituality is talking about that. None of our khutbahs is talking about that. None of our political empowerment is talking about that. The issue of internalized oppression that comes from the political status that the Ummah has in the world, and the specific different groups have different situations of trauma and so on and so forth. None of us has that discussion as a group in the public forum to the point where we have influence. And that's a problem in my estimation, that's missing from the Islamic discourse. The whole issue of the psychological and social impact of oppression. What the hell do you think is going to take place when you have a Syrian community that's been bombed out, has been rejected, or the Burmese, or whatever you want to say? I have to say it like that. Where do you think those people are going to be? That was one of the issues I had with one of the doctors one time. He tells me an Afghani brother comes and he sends his wife to the hospital. He beat her down. Sure, it's a problem. It's a domestic violence issue. We're not going to negate it. We're not making excuses for the brother. He did wrong. But at the same time, that you're saying, oh, the sister, which we should say, oh, the sister, and we should help her. But you're not looking at, oh, the brother. Did the brother, was he a victim to war, this, that? Is it internalized trauma? Why would he violate Islamic principles and destroy his wife like that? There was one brother one time, and I mentioned this example multiple times. One brother, after a khutbah that I did in Ohio, he starts crying. And he says, I told my father that his salah is not accepted because he's drinking alcohol. Arab brother. And so then I got pissed off at him because I told him, I said, how can you, if your father is attempting to make salah, why would you undermine his effort, and tell him his salah is not accepted? There's something obviously going on there if he's getting drunk and he's trying to pray while drunk and maybe leaving the salah. So then upon digging further, I asked him, what happened to your father in his life? He said, my father saw his brother get killed. His brother was murdered. And Palestinian brothers in Palestinian Jordania. And so I told him, I said, see, your father saw that you don't know how he dealt with that situation. And so his drinking may be the direct result of self-medicating to deal with the trauma that is unaddressed. That doesn't excuse him for the haram behavior. But what it does is it gives us an understanding of why it is that he's engaging in that behavior and how to address it. But because we don't want to address issues, we think that we're okay. We're the best of nations, so to speak. And so we what we do is we end up not addressing our problems. We end up not addressing our problems. In building a model for the positive development of black youth, we must be concerned with helping them to neutralize and eventually overcome racism and oppression. And I said we can generalize that to the whole of the community. This must be our ultimate goal if we really desire to achieve our true potential as people and as individuals. And then he says, Dr. Frances Wilson makes note of this goal in discussing what she calls the trappings of white supremacy maintenance. Black and other non-white people ultimately seeking not simply their survival, but their maximal development must therefore compensatorily establish as their highest specific goals and value the maximal development of themselves by whatever means necessary, or it will be extracted from them as the white supremacy system seeks to maintain itself to continue the status quo. So even if you go into the material realm and you develop an education and so on and so forth, that still becomes, you're still in that predatory system. And to be honest with you, European Americans too, they suffer from that reality because that's an imbalanced reality. You know what I'm saying? That's an imbalanced reality in existence for any of us. It's a materialistic existence which is based on race for economic gain. That's the reality of capitalism. And it destroys all of us, to be fair and equal, right, across the board in that regard. Some people get impacted in more, harmful ways than others. So I want to close with this. According to Dr. Welsing, the maximum development of black people will never be fully realized. We've talked about that. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that self-actualization, that pyramid, the base of it is to have your basic needs met. And so if economically you're underdeveloped, it becomes an issue there. A lot of the Muslims in the hierarchy of needs are struggling with the psychological needs and getting to self-actualization. It's just self-actualization for a lot of the Muslims has become degrees in money. But it's not really self-actualization 360 on every level. And what we're seeing in the Muslim community, if you move beyond the pyramid as just being an indicator of individual needs and you talk about it from a social perspective, we're seeing that families are struggling. So that psychological level, we're not getting, there's not a lot of health because there's so many family problems that we don't like to talk about because we keep that stuff, behind closed doors. And that's an issue. There can be no truly functional mental health for peoples of color, meaning patterns of logic, thought, concept, speech, action, and emotional response outside of the practice of counter-racism, as long as the system of white supremacy white supremacy domination remains the major world reality. In other words, as that system is in place, the only existence that's there is survival, really. And that's why you see some of the social problems that are there. Until that system is dismantled, modified, altered, dismantle is the highest goal, you're going to continue to see the problems that you see in the black community. That's why for me, when you talk about gang violence, if you're not willing to deal with the community structural issues, the conversation on gang violence, it becomes, to what extent are we going with that? When I worked in the prison system, the issue became that now when you start talking about reformation of individuals, where do these individuals go? How do they develop? How do they come back into society with limited opportunities? So they may develop other skills in the prison system. Education has higher levels of education, has a higher degree, has a high correlation with a low recidivism rate. The recidivism rate is the return rate, going back to prison after being in prison. We know that the higher education that you get in the prison system and healthy exposure is less likely that the person is going to go back. But even with all of that, if you go into an environment in which you lack opportunities, how are you going to develop yourself? And that becomes the issue, that the two have to go together. The two have to go together. It's like the PhD in engineering in Egyptian society that's stuck with driving a cab because the system has not met where he's at. Right? It's like the brother, the physicist that has to go back and becomes a herder of cows because he has no place in the system. So the system has to match where people are at, or at least create a space for them. Right? So it's not just the individual, and it's not just the society. The two issues go together. And as Muslims, we should be talking about what healthy community is, what healthy society is, and what healthy individuals look like. But in our discussions, we can't just talk about just staying away from sins. We have to also talk about oppression. It's like one sister who's a community activist was telling me, Palestinian sister, saying, the problem with people that they don't realize is that the more difficult you make marriage is that people start going to the haram to compensate for the fact that they can't get married. There's truth to that. We as a community, we don't want to accept that because we want to be on that program of just blaming the individual. But there's some customary practices which block people from fulfilling themselves. When you want $100,000 in total for marriage, or you want a certain level of consistency, this, that, and that's not what the reality is. Or you want a certain type of female look, or a certain type of brother with a certain type of family, with a certain type of career, and that becomes the constant goal for everybody. Best wishes with that. Right. And the end result of that is, depression and Muslims hitting the clubs and in the inboxes and the DMs and the singles networks and everything that goes along with that, or the non-Muslim boyfriend and girlfriend and all of that type of stuff, and everything pornography, everything keeps going. Because the natural course of affairs, where the deen facilitated, we block the means. We tacked on so many, things to that in order to survive. And that's part of the issue, is because we live in a society which is saying that those things are important, and some of them are very important and key and essential and necessary, and some of them are not. We don't need a $50,000 wedding. We don't need a $100,000 mahr. It would be awesome if that $150,000 was into a business effort and people became multimillionaires, and then they can give back zakat and live a simple lifestyle. But that's not how we're thinking as Muslims. Unfortunately, everybody wants to keep up, with the demands of materialistic existence. And I'm not saying don't have nice things. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we should facilitate marriage. And you can have nice things easier with less stress. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.